Chapter 5 is probably the most important chapter of the text. And as you can see in the syllabus, we focus a lot on democracies in terms of our learning objectives. We'll spend a little bit of time on items 1 and 2, but really focus mostly in this slide presentation on the remaining elements as listed on this chart. Also, as a reminder, the CIA World Factbook website is very helpful, as is the IDEA website, particularly when we start talking about elections. So keep those handy. And once again, as a reminder of where regime and government stack up with respect to the state, we're talking about democratic regimes, or the rules and norms of how a government should act or should perform. And of course, the government itself is at the top of the chart here, top of the triangle, I should say. And we'll talk a lot about the branches of government and the institutions, the democratic institutions within the government of democracy. In a democracy, the people rule, which is the foundation of the Greek demos kratia. More modern definition is as listed here. Pay careful attention to the three hallmarks of a democracy: participation in a political process, in policy making, in governance; competition, the representation of varying interests through a political process; and of course, liberty, freedom to act within that entire process and to have your interests heard. Again, remember that a democracy, a liberal democracy, has participation, competition, and liberty, all three. Some countries don't have all three, like Russia, and they are probably more accurately defined as illiberal democracies. We'll talk more about that later in the course. Direct versus indirect really amounts to the role of the people, either indirectly or directly, in policy making and decision making. Most democracies are indirect. And the republicanism imbues a separation of powers amongst those institutions that are representing the people in an indirect representation fashion. History of democracy as depicted here: born of Greece, refined, if you will, in Rome with fixed institutions, and then further refined in England centuries later, limiting monarchy and empowering a representative body to control taxes and other powers for the people. Obviously, democracy is not globally universal, and so it's a fair question: why do some countries become democracies and others not? There are several possible explanations that we'll step through here now. Modernization can help us explain, in part, how democratization happens based on economics and wealth and a population that becomes better educated, more urbanized, more connected. Traditions of authority and hierarchy weaken, and new values of tolerance and gender emerge. In general, the wealth of the country continues to expand. Of course, the evidence is that's quite true. Most democracies are wealthy countries. However, there are several wealthy countries or developing, modernizing countries that are not democracies. Another example is that in a country there may be elites that want to maintain their status and wealth and power, and are not particularly interested in allowing others to control that. So if democracy means that the elite can maintain their wealth, or that the elite can curry favor for international support, or just protects their assets from seizure, then they're more likely to organize in a democratic fashion. The growth and emergence of a strong, organized civil society that's not necessarily or is not really political is also an explanation as to how democracy can rise in a country. some examples there. So the civil society is an important concept for us as analysts. It is life outside the state. It's the private sector writ large, and it's a powerful force. We also have examples of international relations being the impetus behind the democratization of a number of countries, as you can see listed on this chart. Some would argue that democratization happens within a country because of its Western-style political culture, where a liberal political ideology of freedom and a liberal political attitude of continual progress helps focus and bear out individualism, civil liberties and rights, secularism, and various equalities across segments of the population. The evidence is pretty clear. Most democracies are from Western Europe or North America. However, the problem is that countries that don't have Western style values still have democracies. And Japan, South Korea are two examples of that. So now we'll take a look at the inner workings of a democracy in the form of the democratic institutions that are typically at play. And again, remember, institutions are very important for us as analysts because these are things that are self-perpetuating, but more importantly in this context, are valued for their own sake and then are somewhat easy to assess and compare. So executive, judiciary, legislative branches are fundamental to an analysis as we compare democracies especially. Of course, political parties are at play as well. The executive branch typically administers the state, controls, carries out the laws and policies. There are two distinct roles within the executive branch, and not necessarily are performed by two distinct individuals. The head of state is the symbolic embodiment of the people, conducts international affairs. The head of government runs the state and leads the government, makes policies, and directs the officers and ministers within the administration itself. So in a comparison, you could look at how those roles within the executive branch institution are carried out. This chart shows two examples where the roles are distinct and carried out by two different individuals. One is head of state, the other the head of government. Whereas in this example, these two countries both combine the role of head of state and head of government within one individual, in this case, the president. So as you compare countries, this could be a topic of your analysis, and you could draw an assessment as to the role of the executive branch, the power wielded within the executive branch, for instance. Interesting to note that the monarch in the United Kingdom still is the official head of state for a number of countries that are members of the Commonwealth. Where the executive branch presides over the government. The legislative branch really is the body where representatives of the people gather, where the people, in effect, rule the government by proxy. There are two forms, as you can see on this chart: unicameral, which is more common in smaller homogeneous countries, meaning there's one house, one legislative body; or bicameral, which is more common in larger, more diverse countries, and where there's a structure, or within the state, there's a federalist approach. Remember, we talked about central versus federal systems. Oftentimes, when there's a federal system, you'll find bicameral legislative bodies, legislative institutions. And each house in a bicameral format may be elected using different rules, and we'll talk more about. So, a few examples of unicameral and bicameral legislatures. I'd like to point out that United Kingdom, although it does have two houses, the amount of power in one of those houses, as we'll talk more about United Kingdom later, is really powerless at the House of Lords, which is interestingly not an elected house. So more discussion on that later in the course. As we will analyze democratic governments, and somewhat tied to legitimacy as we described in our discussion of state power, is the means to which representatives are chosen. In the lower house of most unicameral and bicameral formats of democratic legislative branches, the people directly elect their representatives. You can see it's the common in the United States, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. However, some of the upper houses in a bicameral format are selected through proxy votes. In other words, indirectly. The people select electors, and in turn, the electors select the representatives for the upper house. And that's true in France and Germany. Then lastly, the members of the upper house in the UK, the House of Lords, are hereditary appointments. So there's no election, there's no connection at all to the people. So you could see issues with legitimacy across these three variations. Certainly the last one having probably the least amount of real legitimacy. And as we'll see, the House of Lords similarly has the least amount of real power within the legislative branch, probably because of that very fact. The rule of law is foundational to any democratic regime. And no one, of course, is above the law, regardless of power, position, or authority. So the judiciary as an institution, from the lowest levels to the very highest, is charged to maintain and uphold the rule of law. System of courts that transcend various echelons of government are in place to judge and to rule on any number of either criminal or civil complaints. And at the national level, courts have a hierarchy, and there is typically an appealing or appellant function within the judiciary as an institution as well. The judiciary is an interesting data point in our analysis and comparison of democracies. Like the other branches of government, there is tremendous variance on how each country forms and empowers its judiciary institution. About that, I mentioned earlier in the course the importance of a constitution and the fact that constitutions generally themselves are institutions. They are firm and respected for their important role they play for a country. At the federal or national level of democratic governance, you'll typically see a constitutional court. Some of them possess what we call judicial review. And what we mean by that is when legislation gets passed and enacted, it has to pass constitutional muster. And the constitutional court executing its powers of judicial review can support or strike down legislation that is not in compliance with the Constitution or the law of the land. There are basically two types of review. Political leaders can bring legislation to the court before it's passed for a review, an azimuth check, if you will, feasibility analysis perhaps, before it goes further. An example, the French Constitutional Court will do that. Or there's concrete review where legislation is passed and then it's brought to the court. The court hears complaints raised by really anyone in regards to a law after its passage. And the US Supreme Court operates in that mode. Most countries, 90% of democracies, have a constitutional court. During Political parties are, of course, necessary because people in a country have different interests, and political parties are organized around those interests. And they're very important for democracies, especially because, as you can see, they touch on two of the three hallmarks of a democracy, and that is participation in the process and competition within the process. So parties provide that vital role for the people. Some countries have two parties, a two-party system. Others have multiple parties. And a lot of that is tied to or driven by the electoral process or the electoral systems within a country. Election. When comparing democracies, if we're doing such an analysis, the executive systems that are at play within each of our case studies can be very helpful. Helpful because there are some real distinctions between at least three of the models that we'll talk about here now. Parliamentary systems have legislative and executive branches that are fused. We'll talk more about what that means in the next chart. Presidential systems separate powers between the executive and the legislative branch, so they are not fused. And then, of course, in a semi-presidential system, which is also known as a hybrid, you actually have two executives, quite often a president and a prime minister. As comparative politics analysts, we need to be careful about judging one system as being better than the other. And so we compare very objectively. So as we compare parliamentary systems and presidential systems, a data point or a point of comparison could be, how is the executive chosen? In a parliamentary system, the chief executive or the prime minister is indirectly chosen by the voters by way of the parliament, where the voters vote for their representatives in parliament or the legislative branch, and within the legislative branch itself, they select the prime minister. Whereas in a presidential system, the voters directly elect the parliament or the legislative branch or the Congress and directly elect the chief executive or the president. Also common to parliamentary systems is a fluid election cycle where, unlike a presidential system that has a fixed election cycle every 4 or 5 years, for instance, in the parliamentary system, there can be out-of-cycle votes of no confidence that end up changing the government, in this case the prime minister and cabinet, or the prime minister himself can call a new election, or again, if the election cycle is come due. Continuing with major points of comparison between the parliamentary system and the presidential system is who actually initiates legislation. In the parliamentary system, it's actually the prime minister and cabinet, which is commonly also known as the government, if you hear that terminology. The Thatcher government, for instance, talking only about the prime minister and cabinet. They'll initiate legislation in a parliamentary system, whereas in a presidential system, it's the legislative branch, the legislature initiates. Another point of comparison would be to look at the relationships or the relations or the power sharing, if you will, between the branches of government. In the parliamentary system, as we already described, there's a fusion between the legislature and the executive. The prime minister himself is actually a member of the legislative branch. He's the leader of the executive branch as well. So there's this fusion. Whereas in the presidential system, there's an executive branch completely wholly separate from the legislative branch. In the parliamentary system, because of the fusion, the judiciary may be a bit of a weaker branch, depending on the country. And then the prime minister himself can easily be replaced between elections. We talked about votes of no confidence. Whereas in the presidential system, again, power is really shared amongst co-equal branches who exercise various powers and checks over each other. And it's difficult to replace the executive between elections. Difficult, but not impossible. Certainly, if there is a infraction of the rule of law, replacement of the executive becomes easier than not. But typically, the executive between elections is not easily replaced as he is in the parliamentary systems. Just a couple of examples, and there are many more than this, of benefits and drawbacks between the parliamentary system and the presidential system. Because it's fused, the legislative and executive branch are fused, legislation tends to pass through not only easier but faster. And also, as a benefit for the parliamentary system, as we already discussed, it's easier to replace the executive. In the presidential system, because the voters directly elect the chief executive, the president in this case, there's more of a national mandate and approval, more of a firm commitment, if you will, between the voters and the chief executive. As to drawbacks, for the parliamentary system, because the people indirectly elect the chief executive, there could be a tendency for the people to feel less in control over the executive and, of course, the passing of legislation. Whereas in the presidential system, the passing of legislation, the workings and outputs of the government can be bogged down and deadlocked in legislation, and it's mostly borne out from the fact that there is a balance and a sharing of power amongst branches. And if you look at those two drawbacks, in fact, this entire slide, this gets directly back to our discussion about state power and autonomy, whereas for the parliamentary system, the drawback is the public is maybe less involved and the autonomy of the government is a little bit higher. Whereas in a presidential system, there's less autonomy because of not so much the public involvement, but because the public is involved indirectly through its representatives in the process and the workings of particularly the enactment of legislation. The hybrid system is a combination of sorts of the presidential and the parliamentary system. Both the parliament and the president are directly elected by the voters, very much like a presidential system. The difference is the prime minister is selected by the president but confirmed by the parliament. So the prime minister still is indirectly elected. And frequency of elections, very much like the presidential system, elections are on a fixed cycle. In the semi-presidential system, the Constitution really stipulates who is the primary initiator of legislation, so it really depends on the country. Relations between the branches of government, because it's a dual executive, where you actually have a separation of part of the executive branch, the president, for instance, from the legislative branch. You still have the other executive who is connected directly with the legislative branch. So it's neither fused nor separated. The benefit of this system is that you have two executives in the executive branch that share power. One is directly elected by the people and therefore has a public mandate, and the other is directly associated with the legislative branch or the parliament, and so there's a connection with the development of laws and legislation. The drawback really comes from, again, the same condition that you have two executives and how well they share power could either propel the system or deadlock the system. And depending on how much power is allowed in either of these positions by the Constitution, there is a chance that the democracy itself could be at risk. An analysis of the electoral processes within countries, especially democracies, really help us to get at how well the democracies are addressing the values of participation and competition within the democracy itself. Of course, those are two of the three hallmarks of democracy, the third being liberty. And we can compare the types of processes, the focus of the elections in terms of people or parties or both, and make a judgment on how well all of that really supports rule by the people in terms of the selection of those that they want to represent them. The single member district system for elections is probably the most familiar of all the systems. This is where there's one candidate for one seat. So, depending on the number of parties, and there typically are more than two, there are two general methodologies. The first, known as plurality, or first past the post, gives the seat to the candidate that simply has the most votes. So if there are 10 candidates, each one gets a percentage of the votes. None of them gets a majority of the votes. That person with the most votes wins. The majority runoff system tries to cull down the field to where there's an initial election, there's a paring down of a percentage of the winners based on the percentage of the votes, and then another election that chooses the candidate with either a majority or the most votes. Typically, a majority runoff is looking for a candidate that eventually gets 51% of the votes. The French presidential election system is a good example of actually both of these systems, the plurality and the majority vote. So if the French presidential election was a simple plurality, meaning whichever candidate got the most votes wins, you could see based on the first round that Francois Hollande was the winning candidate. But note that most of the country did not vote for him. So this is the rationale behind a majority runoff. The second round allows the country at least to choose between the top two in the first round rather than selecting the candidate that got clearly less than most of the votes. In the French system, they take the top two candidates from the first round and they have their second round or runoff. In this case, we can see our two candidates, and the winner received 51.64% of the votes, more than a simple majority, which is all that's required, and therefore wins the election. Important to note now that Francois Hollande could claim now very legitimately a mandate from the people as a directly elected president achieving more than 50% of the vote. Many countries employ what is known as a multi-member district system, which means that a given district can have multiple representatives elected. The number of seats is represented by, in the proportional representation mode, the number of parties that achieve a basic threshold of the popular vote. So voters really elect or select a party, and then the parties present their candidates, the numbers of which are reflected in the proportion of the votes that the party receives. So the logic here is that multiple interests, multiple parties, will actually represent more of the constituencies within the districts. Some multi-member district systems combine both a proportional representation methodology, where again candidates are selected amongst the percentages of the votes that parties get. In addition, there's a individual candidate directly elected as well. Two examples of proportional representation election systems in the Netherlands. There's a 150-member parliament and a number of political parties all vying for those seats, and the parties receive the percentage of those seats based on the percentage of their votes. So if a party wins 20% of the vote, they win 30 seats in the parliament. Whereas South Africa is more of a federalized system of government. There's a national list of 200 members and then a regional list of 200 members distributed across 9 districts. So there's a national vote along multiple parties that seats 200 members, and then each region has its own elections to place members of parliament based on the interests of their region. Some countries combine both the single member district and the proportional representation systems to seat their parliaments. You can see Mexico and Germany are two examples. Germany is a little bit complicated, but we'll study that later in the course. In general, we can see some of the advantages and disadvantages of the majority/plurality system, which is also known as first past the post, and the proportional representation system. The plurality system generally involves fewer and larger parties that are probably more organized, have more accountability within the parties, and the system allows for clear mandates depending on if there's a runoff system or not. In the proportional representation advantage is that there are more and smaller parties, and they represent more interests across the population, and therefore a broader consensus is brought into the governmental bodies. The disadvantages for the plurality system is it really is less representative because it seeks only a simple majority, or in some cases just a plurality of the votes. So the results are disproportional in terms of the elections and the general desires of the population writ large. However, on the proportional representation side, there are disadvantages as well. Because of the number and size of parties, you can risk fragmentation within legislative bodies, for instance, if you don't have coalitions of agreement amongst all of these varying interests. However, an advantage is that you do get a proportional results that again represent a broader consensus of the national interests represented by the parties. Understand the distinction between civil rights and civil liberties. Civil rights are really oriented toward the promotion of equality of condition within a population, the right to affordable health care, the right to an education. Civil liberties, however, are really oriented toward the promotion of freedom, the right or the freedom of speech, the freedom to assemble, the freedom to practice religion. So those are distinct differences. Across the states, however, those can tend to blend a bit depending on the specificity of the Constitution. Some civil rights for one democracy could be enshrined as a civil liberty in another, depending on, again, how it writes the law of its land, and the actions of the courts to defend those rights and liberties. And then lastly, the ideas of the role of the state with respect to rights and liberties. Clearly, the promotion of equality and civil rights you are leaning toward a state that's more of a social democratic state, again, because of its orientation on equality, as an example. So, in summary, remember the three key attributes of democracy: participation, competition, and liberty. All three need to be present. Democratization is shaped by economic, political, social, and international forces. We talked about why countries democratize. And the key institutions within democratic governments are executive, legislative, judicial, and political party systems. Those all exist in some shape or fashion, and they differ from country to country, as we discussed. Remember and keep handy the distinctions between parliamentary, presidential, and semi presidential, also known as hybrid systems, and how they offer different choices on legislative executive relations. Those three basic organizations of a democracy. There are many different ways to elect representatives, as we discussed. Basically, two major ways: the plurality or first past the post system and the proportional representation system. Those two are your basic general systems. We'll talk more about them here in just a minute. And then democracies vary in, as we just spoke about, how they look at specific rights and liberties, and the blurring perhaps across several case studies of what they are and how they're enshrined in respective constitutions. In addition to your texts by O'Neill, you also have the textbook by Aaron Lijphart called Patterns of Democracy. And within this text, Lijphart gives us a very good framework with which to compare democracies. And he suggests that we can place them in two broad categories: majoritarian democracy and consensus democracy. And he frames that entire discussion around this fundamental question in all democracies, and that is, how do we balance the wishes of the majority with those of the minority? Democracies are ruled by the people, but by 51% of the people, which is a simple majority. That leaves 49% in the minority. So fundamentally, within democracies, there is this tension between the majority and a minority that is fairly sizable. In Liphardt's framework, the majoritarian model, therefore, believes that government by the majority of the people is democracy, or majority rule. And in the majoritarian model, 51% is sufficient. In fact, is frankly all that's required. And the institutions and processes that are resident within a majoritarian model reflect that simple majoritarian or majority requirement, 51%. Liphardt's consensus model, however, believes that there's danger in excluding the losing groups from participation. The losing groups, obviously, being the minority. And going a little bit further, it could be a violation of the primary meaning of democracy, which is true if participation is one of our hallmarks, and of course we know it is. So this model suggests that 51% is sufficient, but more is certainly better. In fact, more is really encouraged and desired. So the institutions that we see and processes that we see resident within a consensus democracy reflect that desire, the desire for broader consensus, bringing in more than just the simple majority, bringing in minority interests and the like. So Lijphart identifies for us the 10 characteristics that he suggests reveal majoritarian traits. and he likewise has 10 characteristics that he feels reveal consensus traits as well. This chart obviously reflects the traits of a majoritarian system. And obviously he's broken down the 10 characteristics or traits into two dimensions, the executive's party's dimension and the federal unitary dimension. It's important to remember or to realize that not all 10 of these traits have to be resident within the democracy for the democracy to be characterized as majoritarian. It's up to your analysis and your conclusions to determine where you think the democracy that you're studying falls. Obviously, if there's a majority of these, 5 or 6 or more, then you could make a pretty good case for majoritarian. Or if there are several fewer than that are more dominant, you can make an argument as well for either majoritarian or consensus. Your analysis will probably reveal in all democracies traits that are majoritarian and traits that are consensus. Lijphart does a very thorough job in describing each one of the traits, but I think you can see in the majoritarian system things that are generally minimally oriented, concentration of power in a one-party cabinet, a dominance of legislative or political prowess, a two-party system versus a multi-party system, the elections that we just talked about earlier, disproportional system, interest group pluralism, meaning that there's a dominance of one or two interest groups. In the federal unitary dimension, organized around that grouping, unitary or central government, one house in a legislative branch, a flexible constitution, meaning that it can be easily changed without a consensus of inputs from other branches. No judicial review, meaning that the judicial branch is not even in the process. And then the central bank, which we talked a little bit about, is dependent on the executive. So it's not free to decide and have its own interests additive to a process. So all of these are very much majoritarian in that there's minimal consensus sought beyond a 51% mentality. In contrast, you can see the characteristics of a consensus system really seeks to maximize input, if you will, power sharing arrangements, balancing of power, which means there has to be some kind of dialogue and compromise, multi-party systems versus two-party, meaning more interests are brought into the discussion. Proportional representation, again, reflecting more interests that are actually elected into the branches of government. And then interest groups that have to organize and become corporate and bring in more than just the dominant view, it brings in many views. In the federal unitary dimension, a federal system where now you've got power distributed at regional levels, as we talked about. Strong bicameralism, more than just one house. Now you have two houses that bring in interests beyond the dominant interest. Constitutional rigidity, meaning changes to the law of the land require consensus and dialogue and compromise and deliberate work. It's not just an easily changed document. The judicial branch has a real role and inserts itself into the process, bringing a different dimension, a different view of interests, and an independent central bank, which is not making decisions based on the government's needs per se, but based on the needs of the economy. So that's another dimension, another additive bit of interest that's brought into the democratic process. So again, this broader consensus, this desire to have more than just the simple majority involved. In fact, simple majority is almost not sufficient enough in the thinking of a consensus system. Just a brief overview of Liphardt's model, which is fairly helpful in comparing democracies. We'll reinforce these concepts during our online discussions.